Well, I want to thank you all for coming. You know, when you're the first speaker after lunch, it's always a very worrisome thing, but I'm happy to see we actually have more people here right now than we did before. So I guess you guys went out and you reproduced. Or maybe it was the food at Chick-fil-A or whatever. But you're able to come on back in here. I want to start off by saying, you know, that you heard a speaker, the senator from South Carolina. He was putting out a lot of words per minute. That's what I kind of think of things. And when I hear a lot of words per minute, I think that guy must be from the north somewhere. Because me, you know, I've been down in the south so long that my words per minute, they've just gone way, way down. So I'm not going to talk very fast. But let's talk about a few things here that I think are important, if I can get the computer to work out okay. As you know, my name is Dr. Van Eichenbaum, and I would like to reminisce, I'd like you to reminisce with me a little bit about the subject of freedom and America, our country. We are living in some very, very perilous times, but so many of us don't really understand the nature of the risks that are facing us as individuals and as a nation. You see, true individual freedom is under attack by forces far more powerful and resourceful than ever before. And if you think freedom is not important, just ask someone who has enjoyed life as a free man and had it taken away, or someone who was a slave and experienced freedom. Now, freedom is not a partisan issue to be debated by politicians and used to purchase votes. It's a basic moral right of humanity. Freedom is the absence of coercion, and that's an absolute. And that definition doesn't change based on your personal worldview. Now, most of us believe that as American citizens, we're still free, protected by our Constitution and the Bill of Rights, but nothing could be further from the truth, and I can easily prove that too. Compared to what was originally ours when the Constitution was written, all we have left are a few scraps of liberty that have not yet been stolen by those who seek control over every aspect of our lives. And it's happened very slowly over many, many years, and you've barely noticed. Because it's far easier to ignore painful truth than to confront it. And that's what exactly most of our citizens have been doing for far too long. Most of our fellow citizens are either uninformed, disinterested, or deceived by the false promises of a collectivist future. All you have to do is watch jaywalking when Jay Leno was on the air, and you can see that most of the citizens just have no clue whatsoever. So in the final analysis, it all comes down to one fundamental concept. The right to own private property that cannot be arbitrarily confiscated by the government is the moral and constitutional basis for individual freedom. Period. The government, this is the corollary, the government cannot give you anything that it does not first steal from someone else. Without private property and the liberty it provides, all we have left is the illusion of freedom. Now, I have to confess that every time I watch this montage of images that you just saw, a tear forms in my eye. And I suspect that many of you, if you watch those images, you probably felt the same emotion. Now, had I shown you that same photographic montage 20 or 30 years ago, that tear would have formed because of patriotic pride in our exceptional nation, and also a respect and a love for America. Now, unfortunately, my tears formed because that nation, the nation that we all grew up in, is basically gone. Our national fabric has been purposely shredded by men and women with greed and a lust for power that can only be satisfied by destroying the rule of law guaranteed by our Constitution and replacing our constitutional republic with an oligarchy of arrogant elitists who believe they are so smart that we should be forced to live by their rules. From the dawn of civilization, groups of men have sought to rule over others, and the result is always the same: a struggle to prevent tyrants from eliminating individual freedom. It's just a sad fact that we've been down this road over and over and over again. For centuries, groups of men were governed by a variety of sovereigns, kings, queens, dukes, duchesses, whatever, who owned everything and controlled the lives of their subjects. After we won the Revolutionary War, our founders realized that our land was protected by an ocean that took 2 weeks to cross, and instant communications in any form didn't exist. And so we had a unique opportunity to create a new philosophy of government without the interference from our former European masters. Their concept was the concept of the sovereign man. And to our founders, each individual was considered to be his own sovereign, and therefore free to interact with other sovereign individuals on the basis of equality. The first attribute of the sovereign man is the absolute right to own private property and control its use and disposition. The second is the existence of natural law rights, which of course are divine in origin, that belong to each of us by right of birth. Our Constitution was written to protect and secure property rights and natural law rights from the whims of the majority. We're not a democracy, you know that, and the authority of the central government. To our founders, the totality of a person's property is his land, his home, his possessions, the work of his hands, the ideas of his brain, and his life itself. As a matter of fact, the source document for property rights is the Ten Commandments, which contain prohibitions against envy, theft, bearing false witness, and murder, all of which directly relate to an individual's right to possess and maintain private property and to prevent others from taking it away. Karl Marx, the creator of the communist movement, was once asked what he believed to be the single most important step to achieve worldwide communism. His answer: the elimination of all private property. And in fact, that is the first plank of the Communist Manifesto. Our founders also recognized the distinct difference between natural law rights, which are God-given rights, and collective rights, which are granted by man or by government. Natural law rights impose no obligation on any other person. You have the right to pursue happiness, but you cannot force me to provide happiness for you. You can work to earn money to provide purchase of food, clothing, and shelter, but you don't have the right to obligate me to provide those items for you just because you're not an adequate provider, or because you cannot earn enough money to provide yourself with the lifestyle to which you would like. You can ask for charity from your friends, family, and fellow citizens, but you may not require them to agree to your request. Most people today just don't understand the difference between charity, and that's a voluntary act, and the confiscation of your personal property by government fiat. Now, as evidenced by lots of history, rights that are granted by man or by government can be modified, augmented, or eliminated at any time by the very authority that granted them in the first place. So if you rely on a government right, which is basically theft from everyone else, you're skating on pretty thin ice. At any moment, that right, so-called right, can be taken away. So if a person comes to you and says that they have a right to whatever, your first question should be, at whose expense? That's it. If you claim you have a right to a house, I don't know who's going to pay for it. I don't want to buy you a house. I don't even know who you are. If such a right can only be satisfied by imposing a debt or obligation on another, that act must be considered theft, since its imposition is of necessity an involuntary taking of property, your property. Now, individual sovereignty is the essence of personal freedom, and a colonist, which we were before the Revolution, is by definition not sovereign because he owes allegiance and obedience to whatever authority owns his colony. Having successfully rebelled against England, who was a solitary sovereign, our Constitution's framer inverted the pyramid of power by investing each individual, not any government entity, with definitive sovereign authority. Any power given to the state and the federal governments was considered to be strictly limited and definitely on loan from that sovereign individual. So our Constitution codifies this hierarchy of authority. Each state is sovereign. Each state is a sovereign entity made up of sovereign individuals. Our nation is a federation of sovereign states created by the Constitution, which is a compact ratified by those individual states. The federal government, as I amply told you before, is a creation of that compact. Most definitely not an equal partner, and that's such an important concept. If one reads the proceedings of the ratifying conventions of the individual states, it's clear that their intent was to severely limit the power of the federal government to those powers specifically listed in Article 1, Section 8. As such, the individual states and not the Supreme Court has the authority to determine if the federal government has exceeded its authority. And as sovereign entities, they can remedy that usurpation of power by nullification, interposition, or even by secession. I'm going to let go this the next part of this slide. This was actually part of the slide on Agenda 21, so you can see what the United Nations wants to do to us. But that's another lecture. So I'm going to give you a real-world example of what we're kind of talking about here. 5 individuals get together and they form a corporation to make widgets. They hire an attorney to write a partnership agreement that defines the voluntary relationship between the 5 partners themselves and between the partnership and the corporation. The 5 partners sign the agreement, creating Widget International, Inc. The corporate structure includes a CEO, board of directors, and a legal department. The 5 partners each own 20% interest in the business. The documents define a set of rules and regulations allowing Widget International, Inc. to perform all functions necessary and proper to fulfill its charter, which is to manufacture and sell widgets and properly inform the 5 partners of their progress on a regular basis. So far, that is about the same as the United States around 1800. Widget International, Inc. does really great. Widget sales skyrocket and the profits soar. The board of directors decides that they should have filet mignon dinners, travel in private jets, and meet monthly in faraway exotic places. They also borrow money to build a new corporate headquarters, and cleverly the CEO suggests that they should hire the partners, their relatives and close friends, to work in high-paying executive positions. And as expenses rise, the profit margin starts to shrink. At this point, the 5 partners, if they're good businessmen, would fire the CEO and the board of directors. But our fictional 5 partners are captivated by the trappings of power and success. And so Rigid International continues to spend foolishly and borrow money against future profits to cover their increasing deficit. At the brink of financial ruin, the CEO and the board of directors demand that the partners contribute more capital to the business. They want a bailout. And normally, or actually, they refuse. So the board of directors empowers Rigid International to access the bank accounts of each of the 5 partners and withdraw funds to cover their operating expenses. The CEO asks the legal department, is it legal to do this? Naturally, the legal department, who are afraid of losing their jobs too, they say that confiscation of funds from the partners to be used by the corporation as it sees fit and without the consent of the partners is perfectly legal and legitimate for the general corporate good. And thus, Rigid International, Inc., which was the creation of the partnership, has become, in reality, the owner of the partners and of the partnership. And unfortunately, that's the United States in 2015. Like the scenario that I just went over, each of the states, 13, 50, or even 57 for that matter, are legally, I always like that one, each of these states are legally the creators of the corporate entity called the United States of America. Their creation has 3 branches, legislative, executive, and judicial, none of which is legally entitled to act unilaterally or to deviate from the signed contract or to reinterpret its content. The right to change that contract was retained by the states and only in a legally specified manner. By retaining individual sovereignty, each state has the right to refuse to obey or comply with edicts of the entity that it created. That right is supported by the 9th and 10th Amendments, as we very well know. Technically, any state could withdraw completely from the corporate structure, should its citizens so desire. Historically, of course, that did not work out too well. But constitutionally and based on contract law, withdrawal from a partnership that has been entered into voluntarily, a divorce, if you will, should have been permitted and some satisfactory settlement agreement reached. And that's really the essence of nullification. Each sovereign state voluntarily became part of a corporate structure that they themselves created and specified to have limited powers. So with a firm knowledge of American history comes the understanding of nullification, and that is, as Jefferson stated, the rightful remedy whenever the government violates the Constitution. And the 10th Amendment specifically gives that power to the states, and as we know, to the citizens as well as individuals. And furthermore, there is no article, clause, or amendment in the Constitution that in any way abridges or eliminates that right. Nullification of legislation and regulations contrary to the Constitution is the absolute duty of the governments of the sovereign states, who derive their authority for such action from their sovereign citizens and guaranteed by the Constitution. So why is nullification so difficult? One of the reasons, of course, is the 16th Amendment, which is why the 16th Amendment is such an anathema to freedom. For the very first time, the federal government could come directly into the pockets of individuals and take money. And you know that was not the way the Constitution was written. So what that means is that the federal government has the money in its hand, and states are then begging for the money instead of the other way around. So they are blackmailing us as individual sovereign states, and that is the chain that we have to break. It should be obvious, therefore, that for nullification to be successful, the states must act in concert. They must act together. A large enough number of states, even less than a majority, must act together against an unconstitutional federal overreach. And as the federal government becomes more aggressive in solidifying its power, the stakes in this battle increase in terms of state and individual sovereignty. And there will be a straw that breaks the camel's back. I know that, and you know that too. Now, as you probably know, in November of 2014, I was elected one of the 5 commissioners in Cherokee County, North Carolina. And I began my 4-year term in December 1st of 2014. My platform was very simple and summarized by the closing statement I used at the end of my candidate debate. As your commissioner, the decisions I make will be based on fact, logic, applicable law, and my guiding principles, which are private property rights, limited government, individual freedom, and personal responsibility. Government actions usually have long-term consequences, some of which can be unintended and harmful. I will therefore not cast my vote based on the emotions of the moment, and I will not be bullied into making hasty judgments when careful consideration is required. I expect and welcome feedback from citizens and taxpayers to understand their needs and desires. My goal is to preserve our way of life for our children and grandchildren so that they may understand and live by our rural values. That was my closing statement. But I have one little addition because the campaign was kind of brutal. And so I said to my opponent, and since I had the last word, this worked out really well. You don't even need to go nowhere, but anyway. I said to him, I offer my opponent, I said in the words of Adlai Stevenson's campaign speech in 1952, I offer my opponent a bargain. If he will stop telling lies about me, I will stop telling the truth about him. I kind of got it. I'm very happy and very, very blessed and proud that I won my 71% of the vote. I was the high vote getter in the county. Now, listen, I ran for office as a county commissioner knowing and understanding the fact that North Carolina is a Dillon's Rule state. The counties were created by the General Assembly and they are owned by the state government. And therefore, as a county, you can only operate within the sphere of action that is specifically delegated to the county. In fact, if a county legislates contrary to the wishes of the state government, the state can physically come into the county, remove temporarily, unseat the commissioners, rewrite the offending legislation, and leave. They have that right. So that's a pretty difficult situation to deal with. So incredibly, like in our state, the county government really has limited powers, just like Article 1, Section 8 was supposed to limit the federal government's powers. So it's kind of a reverse situation. So I find myself as county commissioner concocting ways to increase the autonomy of county government. And of course, in doing so, my efforts are aligned with the philosophy of our founders, namely to bring government back to the people, those individual sovereigns and local communities in whom all authority rests, ultimately. So, you have to recognize that money is really the controlling force in government. And the best way to resist centralization of power is to nullify the rules, regulations, and laws in which funding is not directly involved. Because as we said before, because of the 16th Amendment, the federal government blackmails the states. So what you have to do is pick issues that do not involve direct funding. And that eliminates the ability or lessens the ability of the federal government to perform blackmail. So one of the things that I have found very important as a county commissioner is to resist passing or accepting any grants whatsoever that have strings. The strings are what get you. We, for instance, in our county, the previous county commissions for the last 10 years or so have accepted grants totaling over $12 million for our local airport. With those grants come grant assurances, okay? Those grant assurances have to be complied with. And those grant assurances, in this case, involve the taking of private property around the airport And that's where the trouble comes, because we will not approve that, our commission now. And so the FAA and the federal government, their response is, okay, well, we'll give you more money. Well, obviously more money means more strength, and that's what we don't want. We recently had a man come to us, he said, I can get a $3 million loan to build an assisted living facility in Cherokee County if you will get a grant for $100,000 to build the infrastructure for that facility. So we looked at him and said, okay, here's the deal. We will allow our county government to apply for that grant, but you have to give us indemnity against that $100,000. Because if you don't build a facility or whatever, we have to give the $100,000 back. So we made him, before we would even apply for the grant, we required him to put up a bond to cover that money should he fail and the state or the federal government want their money back. He was going to have to pay the $100,000 back. So, one area of nullification that I think is critical, and I believe this to be with all my heart, is in the area of the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment is absolutely, as you know, the most important of all those amendments, because without the Second Amendment, the rest of the Constitution has no meaning whatsoever. So what I would like to do is to show you a video that I made on the Second Amendment. If I can figure out how to do this here.
Video podcast is a presentation of Dr. Dan's Freedom Forum.
The Second Amendment, constitutional guarantor of individual freedom. Of individual citizens represent the greatest single threat to tyrants, and they know it. It's not as if all this hasn't happened before. From the dawn of human civilization, groups of men have sought to rule over others. The result is always the same: a struggle to prevent tyrants from eliminating individual freedom. In 1935, Adolf Hitler and the progressive Weimar Republic enacted universal gun registration laws. Hitler proclaimed, "This year will go down in history. For the first time, a civilized nation has full gun registration. Our streets will be safer, our police more efficient, and the world will follow our lead into the future." Shortly thereafter, Dr. Werner Best, the Gestapo's second-in-command, wrote, "As a rule, we have to assume that firearms in the hands of the Jews represent a considerable danger for the German people." Confiscation of guns from Jews, other targeted groups, and dissidents quickly followed. Between 1939 and 1945, 13 million Jews, gypsies, and other undesirables, disarmed and unable to defend themselves, were arrested and exterminated. Disarming citizens has always been a prelude to slaughter, as proven by the fate of the Jews in Hitler's Germany, political dissidents in Stalin's Russia and Mao's China, the educated in Pol Pot's Cambodia, the Armenians in Turkey, and the Christians in Uganda, to name just a few. Well over 100 million dead innocents bear silent witness to the inevitable consequences of disarming individual citizens. It is the ultimate irony that we can use a quote from Adolf Hitler one of history's most infamous mass murderers, to affirm without doubt the risk to individual freedom posed by gun registration and selective gun confiscation. Suppose we rewrite Dr. Best's statement in a generic form. As a rule, we have to assume that firearms in the hands of blank represent a considerable danger for blank. Once the concept of selective enforcement of gun laws is established, specific groups of people can be targeted and their guns confiscated. As a rule, we have to assume that firearms in the hands of the insane represent a considerable danger for the American people. As a rule, we have to assume that firearms in the hands of Iraq war veterans represent a considerable danger for the American people. How about veterans who have ever had PTSD, or anyone who has ever seen a psychiatrist, or anyone who has ever taken prescription medications like Prozac? Or, as a rule, we have to assume that firearms in the hands of political protesters represent a considerable danger for the American people. It should be obvious how any repressive regime can easily use laws for the registration and confiscation of firearms as a means to control and enslave its people. In fact, totalitarian governments commonly use legislation and regulation to make all citizens criminals. Those laws, once in place, can be selectively enforced against any dissidents or undesirables who are considered a threat to the ruling class. Don't tell me that it cannot happen here in America. It already has in the past and continues to occur on a daily basis. Selective enforcement of speed limit laws is a good example. Most of us exceed the speed limit on a daily basis, but few are stopped and ticketed. Police use arbitrary criteria to determine which vehicles get pulled over, and that's when the fun begins. Aggressive officers, expecting answers to questions they have no right to ask, may also demand permission to search your vehicle, which can turn a minor offense into a Kafkaesque nightmare of serious legal difficulties. In 1942, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, one executive order from FDR led to the incarceration without habeas corpus of 110,000 American citizens of Japanese descent in what we would now call FEMA camps. More recently, when martial law was declared in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, members of the police and National Guard violently abused the constitutional rights of law-abiding citizens by forcing them out of their undamaged homes and illegally confiscating their weapons.
And no one will be able to be armed. We're going to take all the weapons.
Residents were bullied, harassed, beaten, and left without means to defend themselves. Was this law enforcement acting to protect and serve citizens in need of assistance? Not at all. It was an arrogant usurpation of power that should serve as a warning to all of us. Videos, photographs, and eyewitness accounts are now surfacing of similar actions taken by militarized police units and agents of the federal government after the terrorist bombings in Boston. Heavily armed Boston police and Homeland Security personnel were captured on video, demanding entry into private homes, forcibly removing occupants, and searching the empty dwellings, all without provocation, valid reason, or search warrants. If one makes slight adjustments to the uniforms and weapons, these photographs could easily have been taken in 1938 inside Nazi Germany, when jackbooted SS thugs arrested and slaughtered millions of innocent citizens. The Holocaust happened to people just like each of us, people who just couldn't bring themselves to believe that their so-called civilized government would be capable of perpetrating war crimes and genocide against its own citizens. While the Nazis enacted restrictive laws, encouraged violence against Jews and dissidents, and confiscated their means of personal protection, these future victims falsely reassured themselves that the history and highly developed culture of the German people would prevent the atrocities and extermination that subsequently occurred. It is an undeniable fact of history Universal gun registration leads to selective gun confiscation, which leads to the slaughter of targeted innocents who are unable to protect themselves from an armed totalitarian government. Having just thrown off the yoke of tyranny, our founders understood that the citizens of our new nation should always retain the right to prevent the rise of any future tyranny and have the means to do so. The Constitution and Bill of Rights strictly limit the powers of the central government while reserving for the states and the people of the states the authority to restrain and punish the federal government when it oversteps its constitutional limits. The meaning and purpose of the Second Amendment is clear and unambiguous. Its four most important words, "shall not be infringed," are limited only by the period at the end, which was intended to prevent the addition of arbitrary conditions and restrictions. George Washington said, "A free people ought not only to be armed and trained, but they should have sufficient arms and ammunition to maintain a status of independence from any who might attempt to abuse them, which would include their own government." And Thomas Jefferson said, "The strongest reason for the people to keep and bear arms is, as a last resort, to protect themselves against tyranny and government." So, can a well-armed citizenry truly be a deterrent to tyranny? Ask the British. It took only 3% of the American colonists to defeat the most powerful military force on Earth. After their successful attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese did not attack the U.S. mainland. Admiral Yamamoto is purported to have said, "You cannot invade the mainland United States. There would be a rifle behind every blade of grass." There are over 100 million gun owners in the United States. If we assume the colonial participation rate of 3%, that 3 million citizens would constitute the largest armed militia on planet Earth. No wonder they want to disarm us. By including the Second Amendment in the Bill of Rights our founders gave us, we the people, the means to prevent the rise of a tyrannical central government, just like the British monarchy, against which they had successfully rebelled, as well as the current version of the federal government and its bloated bureaucracy that has far exceeded the constitutionally enumerated powers delineated in Article 1, Section 8. Our collective ignorance of history and a willful disregard for its lessons has brought our divided nation to that fork in the road at which we must choose, once again, between tyranny and freedom.
Sir,
Done.
is that video on your Facebook page, your website?
I have copies of that here, if you want it.
Yes, I would. I'll give you a copy of my research paper on the Second Amendment. I read the Constitution law class on free.
Great. Actually, in a couple of weeks, I'm going to have one very similar to that on the Convention of States. If you have elected a constitutional sheriff, as Sheriff Chris Clinton, who is going to be following me, as they have in Cass County, Georgia, he will be able to stand up for our Second Amendment rights. That's why the sheriff you elect is absolutely critical to what happens in your county. I'm going to reiterate in closing the following. Multiple sovereign states and their sovereign citizens must begin now to nullify unconstitutional mandates, laws, regulations, and edicts enacted by the federal government and their out-of-control bureaucracy. There is only one way that nullification can be used, and that is if we all do it together. To quote Ben Franklin, we must all hang together, or assuredly we shall all hang separately. As the federal government becomes more aggressive in solidifying its power, the stakes in this battle increase in terms of state and individual sovereignty. Eventually, and I don't think that eventuality is very far, but eventually there will be a straw that breaks the camel's back. And I have only one question to ask you. Our founders were willing to risk life, liberty, and property for freedom. What are you willing to sacrifice?